For 32 years, every Saturday morning without fail, my wife Eleanor drove 40 minutes across Knoxville to visit her friend Ruth. I never questioned it. Ruth was a sweet old widow who lived alone on the east side, and Eleanor was the kind of woman who didn't abandon people. When Ruth passed away 8 years ago, I expected those Saturday mornings to finally change. They didn't. Eleanor kept driving east. Same time, same direction, same excuse. She said she had taken over watering Ruth's daughter's plants, helping sort through the estate. I believed her, because I believed everything Eleanor told me. For 37 years of marriage, that woman had never given me a single reason to doubt her. I was a retired shop teacher who fixed things with his hands and trusted his wife with everything else. That was our arrangement, and it worked just fine. Right up until the morning my son Derek stood over her fresh grave and told me I had 60 days to get out of my own house. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am 68 years old. I am not a dramatic man. I spent 3 decades teaching teenagers how to wire outlets and read circuit diagrams in a Knoxville high school, and I have seen enough of life to know that most problems have a practical solution if you are patient enough to find it. But standing in that cemetery on a cold February morning, the East Tennessee wind cutting straight through my coat, listening to my son explain in a calm, reasonable voice why the house I built with my own hands no longer belonged to me, I felt something crack open inside my chest that I did not know how to fix. Eleanor had been sick for 14 months. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that does not negotiate. She fought it quietly and with enormous dignity, the way she did everything. In her final weeks, Derek and his wife Melissa had come to stay at the house, supposedly to help with her care. My daughter Connie drove up from Atlanta twice, stayed 4 days each time, cried a great deal, and went back to her life. I was grateful for whatever help they offered. I was too busy watching my wife die to pay attention to the paperwork moving around the edges of our lives. What I did not know, what I could not have imagined, was that Melissa had spent those final weeks not grieving, but strategizing. She was a corporate consultant by trade, the kind of woman who saw every situation as a problem to be optimized. She had recognized almost immediately that Eleanor handled all of our finances, and that I was, in her assessment, an easy mark. While I sat at Eleanor's bedside holding her hand and reading to her from the Book of Psalms, Melissa was in the kitchen, on her laptop, running property searches and reviewing what she thought she understood about our estate. She thought she understood everything. She was catastrophically wrong. But that part comes later. The service was small. Eleanor had wanted it that way. A few colleagues from the elementary school where she had volunteered for 20 years. Some neighbors, our pastor, and our children. The pastor spoke beautifully. I remember almost none of it. I remember the smell of the carnations and the sound of the dirt hitting the casket. And I remember Melissa touching my elbow as the graveside service ended, steering me gently but firmly away from the other mourners. She did not wait until we were even back to the cars. She said they had been talking, she and Derek and Connie, and they were concerned about my situation. She used that word, situation, the way people use it when they mean something uglier. She said the house was too large for one person, too expensive to heat, too much maintenance for a man my age. She said they had looked into a very nice, independent living community in West Knoxville, active seniors, lots of social programming. A woodworking shop, she added. As if that would soften it, she handed me a brochure. It was glossy. There were photographs of white-haired people playing shuffleboard. I looked at Derek. He was studying the middle distance with great concentration. Connie said, "Dad, it just makes sense." I asked who had put their names on my house. Melissa said Eleanor had transferred the deed 6 months prior into a family trust for estate planning purposes to avoid probate. She said this the way she said everything, efficiently, without apology. She said the trust named Derek and Connie as co-trustees. She said that as trustees, they had the authority to decide what to do with the property. She said they had already spoken to a real estate agent. She said the market was good right now. I stood there in the cemetery holding a brochure for a place that smelled, I was certain, of institutional soup and resignation. And I thought about the 32 years of Saturday mornings. I thought about Eleanor behind the wheel of her old Buick, driving east across town, week after week, decade after decade. And I thought, for the first time, that perhaps I had not asked enough questions. I told them I needed some time. Melissa said I had 60 days. The drive home felt longer than it ever had. I let myself into the house and stood in the front hallway for a long time, just listening to the quiet. Eleanor's reading glasses were still on the side table by the couch. Her cardigan was folded over the back of her chair. The house smelled like her. I walked from room to room slowly, touching things, trying to memorize the weight and texture of the life we had built together. I ended up in the bedroom. I sat on her side of the bed. I did not cry. I had been crying in private for 14 months, and I had mostly run dry. I just sat, and I thought, here is what I knew about Eleanor. She was meticulous. She kept records of everything: grocery receipts, utility bills, the mileage on her car. She had a filing cabinet in the small office off the hallway that she kept organized with a precision that always quietly impressed me. She balanced the checkbook by hand every month, even after we got a computer. She was not a person who did things without a reason, and she was not a person who left loose ends. She also never forgot a detail. In 37 years of marriage, Eleanor had remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every appointment. She remembered that I took my coffee with 1 sugar after my doctor told me to cut back in 2009. And she had never once, in all the years since, put in 2. She was the most intentional person I had ever known. So why, for 32 years, had she driven to the east side of town every Saturday morning? I went to her office. I had been in it thousands of times, but always as a visitor. I had never been the one managing the contents. I opened the filing cabinet and spent an hour going through the folders, the way you go through a house after someone is gone, feeling like a trespasser in your own life. The household files were exactly as orderly as I expected. Medical records, insurance policies, tax returns going back 20 years, everything accounted for, everything labeled, except for one thing. On the bottom shelf of the cabinet, behind the hanging files, there was a fireproof document box that I recognized. We had owned it for years, but I had never had occasion to open it. I had assumed it held our passports and the deed to the house and maybe the title to the car, the kind of documents you keep but never look at. I lifted it out and set it on the desk. It was heavier than I expected. It was locked. I sat with it for a moment, feeling slightly ridiculous. My wife's locked box, in my wife's office, in my own house. I went through the desk drawers looking for a key. I found paper clips and expired cough drops and a small collection of rubber bands, but no key. I checked the top of the filing cabinet, the inside of her pencil cup, the little ceramic dish by the window where she kept spare buttons. Then I thought about her Bible. Eleanor read her Bible every morning before breakfast. It was a battered King James, the binding held together with a rubber band, the margins filled with her penciled notes. She had carried it to church for 40 years. I had brought it home from the hospital with her other personal effects, and I had set it on her nightstand because I could not figure out where else it belonged. I went and got it. I opened the cover and turned slowly through the first pages. Tucked between the dedication page and Genesis, so flat and worn it was almost part of the paper itself, was a small card. Not quite a business card, just a piece of heavy cream stock, the kind you buy at a stationery shop. On it, in Eleanor's precise handwriting, were 4 lines. A name, Hargrove Financial and Trust, an address on the east side of Knoxville, a phone number, and below that, in a slightly different pen, as though added later, George, tell him Dorothy sent you. Tell him it is Saturday. I read the card 3 times. Dorothy was Eleanor's middle name. She never used it. Only her mother had called her that. And her mother had been gone for 20 years. I turned the card over. On the back, in much smaller writing, check the bottom of the sewing basket. Blue envelope. Eleanor's sewing basket had sat in the corner of the living room for as long as I could remember, a large wicker thing with a hinged lid, filled with spools of thread and needles. And the kind of accumulated household Small change that gathers in containers that nobody ever fully cleans out. I had walked past it 10,000 times. I went to it now and lifted the lid and dug down through the layers of thread and scissors and folded patterns until my fingers found the smooth paper of an envelope at the very bottom, blue, as promised, and sealed, with my name written on the front in her handwriting. I sat down in her armchair and held it for a long moment before I opened it. Inside was a single, folded page. "My darling George," she had written. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and they have already started. I know our children. I know Melissa. I should have told you everything years ago, but I was afraid you would try to fix it yourself and make things worse, because that is who you are. A man who fixes things. And some things cannot be fixed that way. What I built cannot be taken from you. It is yours entirely. Go to Hargrove on a Saturday morning. Any Saturday. Between 9 and noon. Tell him Dorothy sent you, and say that it is Saturday. He will do the rest. I have prepared him for you. I love you more than I ever knew how to say. Trust the process." She had signed it with just the initial she always used in her notes to me. E. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and thought about 32 years of Saturday mornings. I thought about how she had always been freshly dressed when she left. Not dressed up exactly, but put together, purposeful. I thought about how she always came home in the early afternoon and made lunch and sat across from me and talked about Ruth, or about traffic, or about nothing in particular, looking exactly like a woman who had done exactly what she said she had done. I had been entirely fooled, and somehow that fact produced in me not anger, but a complicated, painful admiration. At 8:45 on a Saturday morning, 3 days after the funeral, I drove east across Knoxville. Hargrove Financial and Trust occupied a modest brick building on a tree-lined street. It looked like it might once have been a dentist's office. There were no signs in the window advertising services, no promotional materials about mortgage rates or investment products. Just a small brass plaque beside the door with the name of the firm. I pushed the door open. The inside smelled of old wood and coffee. A young woman at the reception desk looked up and smiled. I gave her the message exactly as Eleanor had written it. Dorothy sent me, and it is Saturday. The young woman's expression changed in a way I could not quite interpret. She picked up the phone and said something quietly into it. She told me to please have a seat. I had barely sat down when I heard footsteps on a staircase I hadn't noticed, and a man appeared who I guessed was in his mid-60s, trimly built, with the kind of deliberate posture that suggested he had once been in the military. He crossed the room, with his hand extended before he had quite reached me. "Wallace Hargrove," he said. He took my hand in both of his and held it for a moment. "Mr. Whitfield, I cannot tell you how sorry I am about Eleanor." He said her real name with a familiarity that startled me. He said it the way old friends say a name. "You knew her well," I said. He smiled, and there was something in it that was both professional and genuinely warm. "For 32 years, he said. "Every Saturday morning. Come upstairs. There is a great deal I need to show you." His office was a large, comfortable room on the second floor, with windows overlooking the street and built-in bookshelves holding an orderly collection of financial texts and framed family photographs. He sat across from me and folded his hands on the desk, and he began, with quiet, methodical care, to tell me about my wife. The $50 a week she had taken from the household budget, which she had always described to me as her emergency fund, had not gone toward emergencies. She had begun bringing it to Wallace Hargrove in 1992. He had been a young financial advisor then, fresh out of graduate school, working out of a smaller office, building a client list. Eleanor had found him through her church. She had sat across from him for the first time, he told me, with a brown envelope containing $450 in cash, and had told him very specifically what she wanted. She wanted to invest it where it would grow. She wanted it completely separate from their joint finances. She wanted it in her name alone, and she did not want her husband to know. He had asked her once, early on, whether her husband knew. She had looked at him steadily and said, "George, worries about money. I am solving the problem, so he doesn't have to. And then, she had not brought it up again. She came every Saturday morning for 32 years. She sat in that chair across from his desk, and they reviewed the portfolio, and she made decisions. She had an instinct for it, Hargrove said, that he had rarely seen in anyone, professional or otherwise. She was patient in a way that defied the normal human appetite for quick returns. She had bought a small commercial property on the east side in 1997 when the neighborhood was struggling, and held it for 15 years while the area was revitalized. She had put money into index funds in 2009, in the depths of the financial crisis, when most people were pulling everything out in a panic. She had bought a small apartment building in 2014 and managed it through a rental company with meticulous, invisible efficiency. She reinvested every return. She never touched the principal. She also never spent a dollar of it on herself. Hargrove unlocked a cabinet behind his desk and removed a thick accordion folder. He set it on the desk between us and opened it, spreading the contents across the leather surface. Property deeds, investment statements, insurance documents, a notarized copy of a trust agreement with my name on every relevant line. He placed a single sheet on top of the pile and turned it to face me. The number at the bottom was $4.1 million. I looked at it. I looked up at Hargrove. I looked back at the number. 4 million, I said. The words felt synthetic, like I was reading them from a script in a language I did not speak. 4.1, he confirmed, gently. As of last month's valuation, Eleanor asked us to do a full accounting when her prognosis was confirmed. She wanted the number to be current for you. I was a man who had driven a truck with 200,000 miles on it because I could not justify replacing it. I was a man who had packed his lunch every day for 30 years and repaired his own appliances and bought his dress shirts on clearance. I had spent my entire adult life operating on the assumption that we were solidly working class. Comfortable, but careful. A family that looked after its money because there was never quite enough of it to be careless with. And my wife, my Eleanor, had been quietly, invisibly, building a $4 million estate on $50 a week, while I graded shop class assignments and fixed the bathroom faucet. Hargrove gave me a moment. He was good at that. There is something else, he said. When he judged I was ready, he reached back into the accordion folder and removed a small, spiral-bound notebook, the kind you find at any drugstore. The cover worn soft with handling. He placed it carefully between us without opening it. Eleanor left this for you. She called it her account book. She said you would need it to understand the full picture, and that you should read it here, with me, in case you had questions. I picked it up. I opened it to the first page. It was not what I expected. It was not a list of investments or account numbers. It was a record of transactions of a different kind. Each entry had a date, a name, and an amount, and a brief description of purpose. The names were Derek and Connie. I read slowly. Derek, 2008, $40,000. Business loan for landscaping. Company startup. Interest-free. Not disclosed to George. Derek, 2011, $22,000. Legal fees. DUI. Arrest and plea agreement. Record sealed. Not disclosed to George. Connie, 2013, $15,000. Credit card debt. Collection judgment pending. Not disclosed to George. Derek and Melissa, 2016, $60,000. Down payment assistance. Primary residence purchase. Described to George as a gift from Melissa's parents. Connie, 2019, $30,000. Divorce attorney fees and temporary housing. There were smaller entries scattered throughout. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Car repairs and medical copays, and what were euphemistically described as personal difficulties. The total at the bottom of the last page, added up in Eleanor's careful arithmetic, was $178,000. I closed the notebook. She knew, I said. Hargrove nodded. She kept meticulous records. She said she did it because she wanted you to be able to see clearly when the time came. She said that without the records, your instinct would be to give them the benefit of the doubt. She wanted to make sure you saw what she had seen. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Derek's landscaping company, which had lasted 18 months before he declared it a failed experiment and moved on. I thought about the down payment on his house, which Melissa had always referenced in a way that implied significant personal sacrifice and financial discipline. I thought about all the conversations I had never been part of, all the crises I had never known about, all the quiet work Eleanor had done to keep everything from unraveling, while I went about my life believing we were an ordinary family with ordinary problems. She had been the load-bearing wall, and none of us had known it. I squared my shoulders. I asked Hargrove about the trust structure. He explained it clearly and completely. Everything Eleanor had built was in the George and Eleanor Whitfield Living Trust. I was the sole trustee. I had full discretionary authority over every asset. The transfer of the house deed that Melissa had orchestrated 6 months prior had been superseded because the house itself had been placed in the trust 2 years earlier, when Eleanor first received her diagnosis. The document Melissa had shown me, the power of attorney transfer to a family trust, was based on a misunderstanding of which trust controlled which assets. Their trust was real, but it contained nothing. The house, the investments, the properties, all of it was mine. I thanked Hargrove. I told him I needed a few days to think. He handed me his card and told me to take all the time I needed. He also handed me a second card, a referral, a woman named Patterson, who he described as an estate litigator of considerable talent and minimal patience for bad faith actors. He said Eleanor had met her twice. He said Eleanor had liked her very much. I drove home on the interstate thinking about what Eleanor had written. Trust the process. I thought about what that meant. Coming from a woman who had proven herself to be the most patient and far-sighted person I had ever known. I thought about Melissa's 60-day deadline. I thought about the shuffleboard brochure. And I thought about a lesson my shop teacher had taught me when I was 16 years old. Before you put a structure under stress, he had said, you need to know what it is made of. You need to test the materials. I drove home. I called Derek. I told him I had not been feeling well. I told him the doctor was concerned about my heart, that there was a procedure that might be necessary, not dangerous but not cheap. I told him that between the medical bills and the question of where I was going to live, I was feeling overwhelmed. I said I hated to ask, but I needed help. I said if he and Melissa could lend me $25,000, just temporarily, until things were settled, I would pay it back from the sale of the house. I said I was sorry to put him in this position. I laid it on with the full weight of a frightened old man who had nowhere else to turn. There was a pause on the line. Derek said he was sorry to hear that. He said it in the tone of someone who is not particularly sorry. He said they were in a complicated financial position right now, with the house and Melissa's consulting work and everything going on. He said $25,000 was not something they could do on short notice. He said maybe I should talk to a financial advisor about liquidating some assets. He said there was probably equity in the house that could cover medical costs. In other words, he suggested I sell the house they were trying to take from me to pay for a medical problem I did not have. I thanked him. I said I understood. I said I was sure something would work out. Then I called Patterson. She answered on the first ring and told me she had been expecting my call. Hargrove had already briefed her. She had already reviewed the trust documents. She told me to come to her office the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning and to leave the notebook at home for now. She would handle everything else. On Tuesday morning, I put on the suit I had bought for our 35th anniversary dinner, the charcoal one that Eleanor had selected and that I had worn perhaps 4 times since. I polished my shoes. I got a haircut. I looked in the mirror, and I looked like a man who had somewhere important to be. Patterson's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with a view of the river on one side and the mountains on the other. She was a compact, precise woman in her 50s who had the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of human dishonesty and is not surprised by any of it. She shook my hand, offered me coffee, and got directly to the point. Derek and Melissa arrived 20 minutes late. Connie came separately, parking in the wrong garage and texting frantic apologies. They had been told only that there was a meeting regarding Eleanor's estate and that their presence was required. I was already seated at the head of the conference table when they filed in. Melissa registered my presence first. She stopped at the threshold and stared at me, at the suit, at the way I was sitting, and I watched the calculations shifting behind her eyes. Derek laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh. He said something about not expecting to see me there. He said he thought I was not feeling well. I told him I was feeling considerably better. They sat. Connie looked between me and Patterson with the expression of a woman who has begun to understand that she has made a serious miscalculation. Patterson opened the folder in front of her and did not look up. She explained the trust structure in exactly the way Hargrove had explained it to me. She explained the scope of the assets. She was watching them when she said the number. And I was watching them too. I watched Melissa's hand go still on the table. I watched Derek's jaw tighten. I watched Connie's mouth form a small, inaudible word. Then Patterson explained that the property transfer they believed had granted them control of the house was legally subordinate to the trust, and therefore void, and that I, as sole trustee, was the exclusive authority over every asset Eleanor had built. Melissa said that was impossible. Patterson said it was thoroughly documented. Melissa said Eleanor had been compromised at the time of the trust amendment, that she had been on medication, that her judgment was impaired. She said this loudly, and with the particular aggression of someone who knows they are losing and is trying to create enough noise to change that fact. Patterson slid a document across the table. She said Eleanor had anticipated that challenge and had completed a formal competency evaluation, voluntarily, 14 months prior to her death, at the beginning of her illness, specifically to foreclose that argument. She said the evaluating physicians had found Eleanor's cognition and judgment to be, in their words, exceptional. The room went quiet. Then Patterson pulled out the account book. She did not read from it at length. She simply opened it and placed it on the table so they could see Eleanor's handwriting. And she said, quietly, that Eleanor had maintained detailed records of every informal disbursement to each of her children over the preceding 15 years, and that per the terms of the trust, those disbursements had been classified not as gifts, but as demand loans, payable in full upon Eleanor's death. She slid a letter to each of them. Derek owed $62,000, Connie owed $45,000, and Melissa, who had always presented herself as the financial sophisticate of the family, who had sat in my kitchen calculating how to extract maximum value from my wife's death, stared at a demand for the $60,000 down payment loan repayment that bore her signature on the original promissory note. Eleanor had quietly had both of them sign. In 2016, on the grounds that it was just paperwork, just formality, just something the accountant needed. She had signed it without reading it carefully, because she had never imagined Eleanor was the kind of woman who read things carefully. 60 days to repay, Patterson said. In full. Or we file suit and pursue attachment of wages and assets. Derek looked at me. He said, Dad. I looked back at him. He said, You don't have to do this. I said I knew that. He said, She was our mother. I said I knew that too. He said, We made mistakes. He said it quietly, without the aggression he had shown at the cemetery, without Melissa's coaching in his ear. He just said it, simply, like a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive and is not sure what to do next. I thought about Eleanor's letter. I know our children. She had not said they were beyond hope. She had not said to cut them off forever. She had said, Trust the process. I told Derek that I would be in touch. I told him and Connie that the house would be vacant and relisted within 30 days, but that I was setting aside a portion of the proceeds, in a separate account, for each of them. Not a reward, not an inheritance, a one-time bridge, contingent on them each entering into a payment plan for their outstanding loans. If they made their payments for 12 consecutive months without default, I would match every payment with an equal amount deposited into an account in their names. If they defaulted, the match stopped, and the remaining loan balance came due immediately. They would have to earn it. Every dollar. Melissa said nothing. She picked up her purse and walked out of the conference room without speaking to anyone. And that was essentially the end of her presence in my life. I moved out of the house 3 weeks later, into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building near the university. With tall windows and a parking spot and a small room I immediately converted into a workshop. I bought myself a new truck, the first new vehicle I had owned in my adult life. And I felt only slightly guilty about it. I spent that first spring quietly. I had lunch with Hargrove once a month. I had dinner with Connie a few times. She was struggling, genuinely. But she was struggling honestly. And I found I could respect that, even when I could not fully forgive what had come before. Derek called every few weeks. He had taken a management job at a distribution company. He was making his loan payments. He did not talk about Melissa. I did not ask. I thought about Eleanor constantly. The way you think about a person when you are still sorting out who you are without them. I thought about those Saturday mornings. The Buick backing out of the driveway. Her in her good blouse. Unhurried. Purposeful. I had spent 32 years watching her leave and never once thought to ask where she was really going. I had trusted her completely, which she had known and counted on, and she had used that trust to build something that saved my life. In October, I went to see my old principal at the high school where I had taught for 30 years. I told him I wanted to fund a scholarship, specifically for students going into the trades, electrical, HVAC, plumbing, carpentry, the disciplines that keep the world running, and that nobody ever puts on a brochure. I wanted it to be enough to cover full certification programs and tools, and the first year of apprenticeship fees. I wanted it to be called the Eleanor Whitfield Skilled Trades Award. He sat across from me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "George, she would have loved that." He was right. She would have. Eleanor had believed her whole life that the most important things were the practical ones. The ones you could put your hands on. The ones that produced a tangible result in the world. She had built her estate on the same principle. Patient, practical, invisible work, compounding over decades, producing something solid and real and lasting. I went back to Hargrove's office on the first Saturday in November. I sat in the chair where Eleanor had sat every Saturday for 32 years, and I told him what I wanted to do. He listened with his hands folded on the desk, and a look on his face that I had come to recognize as his version of profound satisfaction. We set up the foundation together. The endowment was structured to generate scholarship funds in perpetuity, which was the kind of word that previously would have had nothing to do with my life, and now had everything to do with it. On the drive home, I stopped at the cemetery. I parked and walked through the quiet rows to where Eleanor was. I did not have anything in particular to say, which is unusual for me because I have always been a man who processes things out loud. I just stood there for a while in the November cold, looking at her name cut into the stone. I thought about 32 years of Saturday mornings. I thought about what it takes to carry a secret that large, with that much patience, for that many years, without bitterness, and without a single moment of self-congratulation. I thought about the card she had tucked into her Bible, written carefully in 2 different pens, prepared against the day when she would not be there to hand it to me herself. She had known the storm was coming long before the clouds appeared. She had spent 32 years building the shelter, stacking it board by board on $50 a week, while I went about my ordinary life, trusting her completely and never understanding what that trust was really for. My wife was not a flashy woman. She did not call attention to herself. She wore sensible shoes and drove a practical car and always seemed perfectly content with what we had. Because she knew, better than anyone, exactly what we had. She was the most powerful person in any room she ever entered. And no one, including me, ever saw it coming, until it was already too late to pretend otherwise. I stood at her grave until the light changed and the temperature dropped another 2 degrees and a groundskeeper appeared in the distance doing the afternoon rounds. Then I straightened up, put my hands in my coat pockets, and walked back to my truck. I had a meeting the following Saturday. There were scholarship applications to review, and Wallace had pulled together a short list of candidates that he thought I should see. A girl from Sevier County, who wanted to be an electrician. A young man from Oak Ridge, who had been apprenticing part-time as a plumber while working double shifts to pay rent. People who needed exactly what Eleanor had understood the world runs on, which is patient, invisible, practical work that never makes headlines but keeps everything standing. I had a great deal left to do. I started the truck and pulled out of the cemetery and drove west through the city as the last of the afternoon light caught the Tennessee River and turned it briefly, brilliantly gold. I did not look back. I drove toward whatever was next, which is, I think, what she always intended.